Beginning around 10,000 years ago, humans began to domesticate plants and animals. Rather than being some sort of linear progression, as archaeologists once thought, it's now realized that crop domestication developed in regions where there was a diverse zone of productivity for plants and animals to thrive, spanning multiple kinds of environments in close proximity. There are multiple centers of domestication across the world, but conversely, there are only 4 real centers of highly developed, complex civilization in the Old World: Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and the Yellow River. Probably everybody watching this video knows these civilizations. What you may not know is that there is a 5th Old World River Valley civilization, which thrived for about 600 years and then totally vanished. While it existed, it influenced all of the surrounding regions, from Mesopotamia to the steppe to the Indus Valley. It came like the wind touched everything, and eventually, like the wind, was gone. It had no successors, it appears to have imparted no cultural legacy. It quite literally was lost to history until the early 1970s, when Soviet archaeologists uncovered it. The Bactria-Margiana archaeological culture, better known as the Oxus Civilization, lasted between approximately 2250 BC and 1700 BC, and then declined between about 1700 and about 1500 BC. Now, before going any further in this video, I really need to give a shout out to those of you who support this channel on Patreon. I know I say that the research for this channel would not be possible without you guys, but in this case, I do sincerely mean it. After the fall of the Soviet Union, archaeologists from Europe and North America were able to excavate alongside Russian archaeologists really for the first time, but the majority of the voluminous literature on this civilization is still locked in Russian. In November of 2020, though, a 1,000-page book was published which synthesized everything, and it was published in English. It was prohibitively expensive and I would not have been able to afford it otherwise, so thanks to my patrons, you can consider everything in this video to quite literally be at the cutting edge of what archaeologists know about the Oxus Civilization. The core area of the Oxus Civilization was in northern Afghanistan, southern Uzbekistan, and eastern Turkmenistan. In antiquity, the region was known as Bactria and Margiana, and it was bounded in the north and the northeast by the Eurasian steppe and the Pamir Mountains and the Tian Shan Mountains, to the southwest and southeast by the Kopet Dag and the Hindu Kush mountain ranges. Multiple rivers flow through this region, most notably the Amudarya, in ancient times known as the Oxus, hence the Oxus Civilization, and the Sirdarya, once known as the Jaxartes. At one time it was thought that this constituted a core region and that there was a peripheral zone, but the discovery of sites in the northern Indus Valley, northeastern Iran, and western Tajikistan has called this division into question, and this division of core and periphery may very well not have existed. Experts are not really certain if this was a civilization that had writing, thus we have limited information. How exactly do you derive culture from purely material culture? Artifacts don't necessarily inform us about what language people spoke, or about other aspects of identity, but what does appear to be apparent is that the Oxus Civilization was the center of a vast trade network well before the Silk Road or the vast empires of classical antiquity and the Middle Ages, which thrived on trade networks, ever existed, and that trade network stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf to the Indus Valley. But if the name of this civilization has been recorded in other sources, we are not really sure what it was called. The first discoveries of this civilization were made only in the early 1970s on both sides of the Amudarya River by Soviet archaeologists. There were earlier discoveries of what would eventually be recognized as Oxus sites, which were made in the 1950s and the early 1960s, but they were not connected together, and at the time they were considered to be part of the Kopet Dag Late Bronze Age, also known as the Namazga period, named after the Namazga Tepe site in Turkmenistan, which sets the chronology for large swaths of Central Asia in this period. It was that region, combined with southern Uzbekistan, which became the main area of excavation after sites in Afghanistan were looted, and in this region, the largest city of the Oxus Civilization has been discovered, Gorno Tepe. Sometimes this is called the capital of the Oxus Civilization, in part because it features monumental architecture, including what appears to be a large palace and a necropolis where elites were apparently buried, but if that is not actually the case, at the very least, this was a major urban center. Many of the sites of the Oxus civilization and the overall material culture were discovered on what appears to have been virgin soil, essentially places where there was little to no evidence of previous habitation, and the artifacts and sites were of a very short duration, only a few hundred years. The earliest discovered sites of the Oxus civilization were at one point thought to have originally started shortly after the Namazga V period, essentially the Middle to Late Bronze Age of Central Asia, between about 2500 and about 2200 BC. What was believed to have occurred was that there had been some sort of an environmental problem which forced an urban crisis, and the populations then had to move from sites in the Kopet Dag Mountains, and thus the Oxus civilization sprang up in virgin soil from the ruins of this mother culture. However, by the late 1980s, it was clear that, although things like pottery and grave deposits were indeed similar, there were in fact regional differences, and further excavation of other sites showed clearly that this proposed west to east movement was wrong because the chronology did not match. Radiocarbon dates in the 1960s and 70s were rare, and the date ranges between about 1700 and 1100 BC, and about 2000 and about 750 BC were both proposed. Once the relevant technology was able to be employed, though, this chronology shifted in the late 80s, and combined with the discovery and excavation of more sites in Tajikistan, the dates had to be seriously revised, placing the Oxus civilization between about 2250 and about 1700 BC. In the early stages of digging, what would eventually become the Oxus civilization was, in a word, bizarre, because artifacts identified with various cultures and regions from all over the place were just popping up at these sites. Many artifacts actually have been recovered from Oxus cemeteries, which tend to be extremely numerous in Central Asia, although lamentably about 80% of the cemeteries in northern Afghanistan have been looted. But it is especially striking because the sheer volume of stuff that archaeologists have recovered doesn't appear before or after the Oxus civilization was around. From the evidence that has been uncovered, this culture is probably best understood as one which was based around trade, and which functioned as middlemen and merchants for trade in tin, copper, smelted bronze, oil, and many other goods. Oxus artifacts such as trumpets, small stone columns, seals, ornate metal vessels, and stoneware have been discovered everywhere from northern Iran to the Persian Gulf and what is today Oman to the Indus Valley. Analysis of bronze from several Mesopotamian sites has revealed that the tin used in the creation of that bronze came from Central Asia, especially the Hindu Kush and the Pamir Mountains, and we know that the presence of that trade in tin was actively recorded by Mesopotamian scribes on cuneiform tablets. The presence of steppe nomads and pastoralists associated with the Andronovo culture, usually understood to have emerged from the Shintashta culture, was observed almost from the beginning. Incised pottery, a common feature of the Andronovo, which professionals largely agree to be the physical manifestation of people who spoke Indo-Iranian, has been found in many Oxus sites, but the coexistence of nomadic and settled groups really begins to show up towards the end of the Oxus chronology, when the civilization began to decline. So at one point, archaeologists interpreted this to be something like a conquest of the region by speakers of Indo-Iranian, but the presence of kurgans, mounded tombs associated with steppe groups at the time on the northern edges of the Oxus zone which predate the end of that civilization, has caused experts to rethink this particular argument. The nomads, it seems, had always been there, possibly sometimes as foes, but probably always as fellow traders. More than anything else, though, the Oxus civilization has been strongly associated with the Indus Valley civilization, and the Indus Valley chronology is sometimes used to divide up the periods of the Oxus civilization. It's a chronology which actually has a variety of schemes for breaking it up, so a synthesized chart should be popping up on your screen right about now. items from the Oxus culture were discovered at Indus Valley sites in the 40s, before the Oxus Civilization was known, and the subsequent discovery of Indus Valley artifacts and Oxus sites in the 70s and the 80s, especially at Alting Tepe, Dashli, Jarkutan, and Gorno Tepe, such as carved ivory, etched beads, bangles, and Indus Valley seals, as well as Indus Valley pottery at the Gorno necropolis, strongly attests to connections between the two. At one point, it was thought that this maybe represented a northern expansion of the Indus Valley civilization, but with further excavations and the discovery of an actual Indus Valley settlement at the southern edge of the Oxus zone in eastern Bactria, we now know that the chronology for something like this does not exist, and that instead, the two were just deeply connected trading partners. Science is drastically changing what we can learn about the past, especially climatology. Today the area is fairly dry, but we know that the Oxus Civilization sprang up in the region during a 4.2 kilo-year mega-drought event, which appears to have been so devastating that it's credited with helping bring down the Akkadian Empire. Despite this, the Oxus zone appears to have been a fairly wet area, comparatively speaking. Not quite a region that was fully lush, but certainly one that was more than just an area where desert is sprinkled with oases. We have evidence of a healthy combination of moist zones, salty marshes, steppe, and desert in the area, and we have the remains of wild boar, gazelle, and asses popping up in the archaeology. Recent studies have also shown that the wood used for building and for fuel came from both riverine and semi-desert environments. Sand appears to have been present from the start, but was held at bay by shrub vegetation. But towards the end of the Oxus Civilization, a changing climate, which we will come back to, ensured that those dunes advanced into the temperate zones. It's not certain at this time if there was irrigation for crops in these semi-desert areas. There are the remains of numerous structures which appear to be canals, but many of them entered the cities, and so archaeologists currently think that they were for managing water levels for urban centers rather than for irrigating crops. Now that being said, it's very probable that the Oxus Civilization grew out of the Kopet Dag Mountains, specifically that it grew out of the Namazgha culture which had existed in that area since the Central Asian Neolithic. What we do have for certain are some pottery shards from period 3 of the Namazgha culture, and it's probable that agriculture developed out of this region, but there was actually a gap of a few centuries between the evidence of the Namazgha 3 in what became the Oxus zone and Namazgha 5 and the development of the earliest phases of the Oxus Civilization. So right now, it's really difficult to say anything more than this, and we need more digging. The Oxus urban centers appear to have been pre-planned, or at the very least, that's what it seems like. There does not appear to be much evidence of an untidy sprawl in one portion of an urban center from which the whole thing then grew out of, and then became organized. Instead, the centers are all laid out in grid patterns surrounded by up to 3 rings of walls, often with round or square towers and open places in between the walls, possibly as killing zones for archers should one layer of wall be breached. There were large palaces and temple complexes as well, or what appear to be temples, but the interesting thing, when you zoom out, historically speaking, is that Central Asia has a very long tradition of circular planned cities. Indeed, it's been argued that Baghdad was influenced by this model because the original plan of that city was circular, with 4 gates, and the fact that these Bronze Age Central Asian urban sites were rectangular is rather striking due to what appears to have been a break in that architectural tradition. As we went over at the start of the video, the site of Gorno Tepe is the largest one which has been excavated, and the one which has been excavated most extensively. So while this might eventually change, at present, we are most informed about the Oxus Civilization through this one particular urban center. A variety of cereals, including barley, wheat, and millet, were cultivated, and grapes show up for the first time in Central Asia during this period. Sheep and goats were the most common domesticated animals kept for sustenance, but evidence of pigs and asses show up as well, although not the horse, at least not in any really significant numbers. The presence of agriculture obviously makes sense given the presence of cities and fortified sites, but our evidence of mobile populations is growing with each archaeological season. We don't know right now if this is evidence of Indo-Iranian speakers living alongside these settled people, or if it's the presence of a local pastoralist group, but certainly it suggests that mobile populations were constantly interacting with settled zones. Beyond this, it is difficult to say very much about the political and religious aspects of the Oxus civilization. Older archaeological practice was to dig quickly, while newer techniques are much more careful and take multiple seasons to get through even a portion of an archaeological layer, so we lack nuanced stratigraphy for larger sites which were excavated when this was all first discovered. Much of the focus has been on those large sites, and the smaller ones, which might provide more evidence of daily life, have not been properly studied yet. At the moment, we have only very limited evidence for things like craft workshops, something crucial due to the intersection of trans-regional trade routes in this area, but what evidence we do have strongly suggests that, due to the presence of tin in the mountains just to the east of the Oxus civilization, and the lack of mineral and metal veins in the immediate region, it was mined and brought into Oxus settlements, refined, worked, and then shipped outward. We lack any sort of direct evidence for this practice in Afghanistan, but we actually have archaeological evidence, like pottery tools and other artifacts, a bit farther north, from the Zarevshan Valley, which indicates that Andronovo-related populations were probably doing the mining in the region, and then trading with the Oxus populations. The control of these trade routes and the goods which moved along them made the Oxus culture extremely wealthy. Because we lack solid evidence of writing, at the moment anyway, most scholars who study this quibble about whether or not the term civilization should fully apply, but even if this is disputed among professionals, they all agree that at the very least it was proto-urban. In other words, one step away. At the current stage of excavation, the main site of Gorno Tepe covers at least 50 hectares and possibly, depending on where exactly you draw the line, up to 130. This appears to be the largest urban center, but others are up to 30 hectares. So, what was this? How did this operate politically? There is not enough evidence to create some sort of scholarly consensus, so while some specialists view the urban centers as individual polities, another view is that the Gorno Tepe site was the capital of a proto-state. If that was the case, then it only appears to have applied between about 2250 and about 1900 BC. After that 350-year period, the sites begin to shrink a bit. The northern portion of Gorno Tepe itself appears to have been abandoned. Perhaps there was a population decrease, but whatever political system initially existed very likely changed, and power probably became more loosely defined. The grave goods point to a tripartite division of society, with an elite, whether political, religious, or military is not clear, but some scholars have suggested that it was all three combined. And then there were two other groups beneath them. It's not clear at this time if this was something like a middle and a lower class defined by economics, or something like a caste system, or groups of freemen and slaves organized by legal distinction rather than economic distinction, but the presence of elite graves points to something like those elites being about 4% of the entire population, with the middle group being about 86%, and then the remaining 10% being comprised of slaves or an underclass or something along those lines. It's just very difficult to say right now as we lack written sources. But in some ways, this is the easy bit of interpretation. Things become extremely difficult when trying to understand buildings which appear to have a religious function. In the early stages of the Oxus chronology, but really only at Gorno Tepe, there are several complexes of buildings and courtyards which have rooms within them that contain either ash and smooth walls, or ash and walls with niches carved into them, which bears a resemblance to Mesopotamian buildings which we know actually are temples. But these buildings don't have any evidence of cult activities. In the middle and later stages of the Oxus civilization, it becomes a little more clear because in the fortress cities of the Oxus, there are rooms which were painted white with podiums in them, and on the podiums, or on the floor and thus broken, were jars, analysis of which have revealed the presence of hemp seeds or ephedra pollen. So at the very least, it would appear that these were rooms where people maybe imbibed drinks which had some sort of psychoactive substance in it. There also appears to have been evidence of fires in these rooms, so this, combined with the presence of those ash piles from the previous period, has led some to make the suggestion that perhaps this is an early stage of fire religion, which became Zoroastrianism, but that doesn't have very much widespread support. Some specialists have suggested instead that the presence of these psychoactive drinks possibly points to the presence of soma, a drink which became important in Indo-Iranian religion, which brings us to the end of the Oxus Civilization. The Oxus Civilization existed in a world which was extremely interconnected. You did not walk in one direction and then hit a wall. Instead, you encountered other cultures. Sometimes those interactions probably were violent. Sometimes they probably were extremely violent. We should not try to paint a rosy picture of the past here, but this also was not a zero-sum game. Many of those interactions were peaceful, as we've been discussing for this entire video. This was a world dominated by trade and traders. Eventually, you're going to get intermarriage among at least some people, and it would likely have been normal to have a working knowledge of at least one other language, probably more. We know that to the north of the Oxus Civilization were people who spoke Indo-Iranian, which is a branch of the Indo-European language family, and we know that the peoples of the Oxus Civilization spoke a language which was not Indo-European. Now, how do we know that? And why does it matter for understanding the end of this civilization? Well, Indo-Iranian appears to have split at some point. It diverged into two different language groups. And just as a note here, this is a topic which becomes extremely technical extremely quickly, so I am closely following the work of Michael Wetzel and Asko Parpala, two historians who are preeminent in this particular field, and these two language groups are Iranian and Indo-Aryan. To a degree, all archaeological cultures are artificial. And really, this goes beyond archaeological cultures to pretty much anything in history. Archaeologists and historians impose concepts and periodizations onto the past in an effort to try and study it. Things are not ever completely a direct reflection of reality, and this is largely done because we tend to have certain types of evidence in abundance, like pottery. This is why history is an interpretation of the past. Some of our evidence is garbage, literally and figuratively, but just to illustrate the point. Think about those plates and bowls you have in your cabinets. Those aren't necessarily strongly indicative of your identity, are they? But if that's what archaeologists have thousands of years from now, then that's the evidence they have to work with. So, defined by pottery and some other things, we know that the Andronovo culture was a thing, quote-unquote, that existed, but it was not completely homogeneous, and there were archaeological subcultures which existed. Some of the Indo-Iranian languages appear to have split off first, and historical linguists believe this to be the case because we have found it in the texts of the Mitanni, a state from the Near Eastern Bronze Age around 1500 BC, maybe a little bit earlier, although we should note here that these dates are always being tweaked. The bulk of the Mitanni population spoke a non-Indo-European language called Hurrian, but there are loanwords in the language, relating to concepts like chariots and horses and gods, and concepts of rulership, and it would appear that speakers of this language somehow came to dominate and rule the Hurrian speakers. These people are known as the Marianu. In Iran, around the year 1000 BC, we have the Avesta, the oldest text associated with Zoroastrianism, and the language it's written in is definitely a form of Iranian. Now, in South Asia, the language is split into a branch called Indo-Aryan. The texts associated with its speakers, especially the Rig Veda, are similar to stories contained in the Avesta and other Indo-European mythologies. But professionals have noted that there appear to be about 383 non-Indo-European loanwords in the oldest layers of the Rig Veda. So Iranian and Indo-Aryan split at some point, and the similarities are close enough that it can't have happened that long before the Avesta was recorded, so it's believed to be around 1500 BC or thereabouts. Now, 55 of those 383 loanwords in Proto-Indo-Aryan also appear in Proto-Iranian when the split was happening, and the remaining 328 words then become mixed into Proto-Indo-Aryan later on, after the languages diverged. And the speakers of Proto-Indo-Aryan appear to have been in greater contact with the group that put those loan words into the language, and those terms which show up are closely connected with concepts related to farming and to cities. Now that being said, before moving on to the end of the video, let me just take a moment to clarify one thing. Indo-Aryan languages are spoken today in South Asia, which includes India, hence the Indo prefix. Languages are not these magical things which move themselves. People need to do it, which means that what we're talking about here, at least in part, is a movement of people who spoke Indo-Aryan languages into South Asia. When historical linguists started coming to this conclusion, archaeologists were beginning to excavate the Indus Valley civilization, and because it was in ruins, the idea was put forth that there was some sort of a violent takeover, and thus the destruction of the Indus Valley civilization. But we now know that this chronology actually doesn't match up. It's backwards. The Indus Valley was largely already either in decline, or pretty much done already by the time this started happening. All of this at the time was presented as the Aryan invasion theory, and it was used to justify some pretty horrible stuff in Indian history. But no professional scholar of these subjects takes this seriously anymore, because the reality appears to be much, much more convoluted. It's that bit about the Indus Valley civilization that's going to help explain the substratum of non-Indo-European loanwords. In the late 3rd millennium BC, in other words, the period when the Oxus Civilization appears to start a decline, there is evidence of widespread climate change, specifically a series of droughts and a general drying of the environment. This is not something which happened all at once. This appears to have been a process which took a few hundred years at the very least. What this means, then, is that the steppe would have started to become unsuitable, and around this time, there is more and more evidence of pastoralists living around Oxus sites. Around 2000 BC, graves start popping up in Oxus territory, which contain Oxus and Andronovo pottery and metalwork and weapons. So people were probably moving from the steppe into the Oxus region. Now how are they getting there? The answer is that they're going through the Inner Asian mountain corridor, which crisscrosses in a circuitous route through all of the mountain ranges which lead from the steppe to the Oxus and then eventually into South Asia. It takes a very long time to get from point A to point B. So, if those loan words deal with agriculture and with cities, well, it would make sense that the speakers of Proto-Indo-Aryan picked this up from members of the Oxus civilization and that it was done very gradually over time. Eventually, some of those Indo-Aryan speakers made their way through the Hindu Kush into South Asia, and we know that people from the Oxus civilization came with them either on their own or because they had since married into the speakers of Indo-Aryan. Because there are DNA signatures from the steppe present in many South Asians today, but there are also signatures characteristic of those who lived in the Oxus civilization present in South Asians. Now, this was also a mixed interaction. We should not write this off as a violent conquest or a peaceful movement. This is not an either-or situation, and it would be very wrong to present it like that. The reality, based on what we know from a combination of archaeology, linguistics, and modern migration theory, is very likely that it was all of them, depending on when and where you were, especially if you were on trade routes. As these groups mixed over the centuries, the Oxus civilization would be lost to the sands of time. But from the blending of the Oxus civilization, Indo-Aryan speakers, and the remnants of the Indus Valley civilization, a new culture would emerge, one which is, in many ways, still with us today. And that civilization is Vedic India.